Welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Recasting the Arab, Middle East, and beyond. What is the condition of the Arab Spring? Are humanitarian interventions effective? What about the law of unintended consequences? And is the West still determining the geopolitical fate of this vast region? Crosstalk the future of the Arab world and Muslim lands, I'm joined by Richard Weitz in Washington. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute and an expert at Wikistat. Also in Washington, we have James Phillips. He is the Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. And in London, we go to Daud Abdallah. He is the current Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Richard, I'd like to go to you first. This is a very broad program looking at a lot of events over the last year. About a year ago, the West was very concerned with the possibility of Islamic democracies, and they were very worried about it, all the way from Tunisia to, let's say, Iraq. I mean, has those fears been allayed now?
That's a good question. I mean, you probably can see common trends, since there's been, as Samuel Huntington pointed out several decades ago, you often see these waves of social mobilization and democratization. So what started off in Tunisia started spreading through to other parts of the Arab world. And the common trends are people are more open about protesting, expressing dissatisfaction, using social networks. But I think the key variable has been the regime response. So when the regime has responded very ineffectively, as in Tunisia, they lose power. When they respond in a way that antagonizes the international community and they're not that strong, as in the case of Libya, well, then you suffer international intervention. In other cases, Bahrain, Syria, Iraq, possibly, it's still unclear. I mean, because the regimes have responded more effectively in the sense that they've managed to contain the spread of violence. But I think we have to look at this as the way Chu Enlai said about the French Revolution. It's too early to tell what the long-term impact will be.
Exactly. James, what do you think about that? Because it seems to me is that as we go through this process here of regime change, if it's going to be done indigenously, like we saw in Tunisia, and then we see an outside intervention, and I think we'd all agree that Libya is kind of in a mess here because we see regionalism, we see the federal state not very strong or not getting stronger. And then we have Syria. And the longer we go into this process, the more regimes learn how to maintain their control, okay? And in this case of Syria, to use military forces. And we see outside intervention too. If it's legitimate or legal or illegal, we see this internationalized. So the same question to you, do you see major trends or is it just one-off each time?
Well, I would agree with what Richard said, that at base, the motivation of many of these movements is quest for freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, in some cases religious freedom. But each country, of course, is unique. The course of the revolutions depends on the response of the regime, the strength of the regime, the degrees to which it bends with the wind and makes compromises, or in the case of Gaddafi or Assad, brutally tries to put down their own people. And in there, it's unclear where the revolution may go in the future, although I think there are many common denominators about the beginnings of these revolutions, but revolutions are very hard to predict. They can be hijacked, as we saw in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, Iranian Revolution. So it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen going ahead.
Okay, Daud, if I can go to you in London. I mean, how much is this these changes in the Arab world, in North Africa and beyond? I mean, has to do with geopolitics, because Gaddafi wasn't loved by the West. I mean, they embraced him, but when they had the chance, they dropped him very quickly, like a hot brick. And then here's Assad. I mean, this is again, it's a very internationalized situation right here, where the countries like Russia and China saw the United Nations Security Council through the United United States and its allies abuse, what a lot of people would say, Resolution 1973 to topple a regime. I mean, have we gone through some kind of process here where the West sees this as an opportunity for regime change when at one point in time it's really actually about what's happening on the ground and what people want there? I mean, what's happening in Syria is extremely unclear.
Well, there's no doubt that there are significant international geopolitical interests across the region, but it varies from one part to another. If you recall, in the case of Tunisia initially, the French foreign minister at the time, she offered to the support of the French military, and she actually called for intervention to save the Ben Ali regime. Ultimately, that costed her her job. Clearly, the French had a geopolitical interest here. But if we look at the case of Syria, I think the prospects for intervention, whether we call it liberal or not, it's much more constrained because Syria itself is part of a larger geopolitical bloc. Unlike Tunisia, Tunisia was very much on its own in North Africa. But Syria is part of a bloc that constitutes Baghdad, Damascus, Tehran, and Beirut. Of course, guided under the tutelage of Tehran. And for this reason, intervention in Syria will not be targeted against the Damascus regime per se, but against this larger bloc, and hence the reason, the hesitancy to intervene in Syria militarily.
Okay, Richard, what do you think about that? Because it's a very good point that we just heard here. I mean, we can all talk about liberal interventions, helping people, responsibility to protect, all these nice things, okay, democracy. But then when it gets down to something so geopolitically important as a country like Syria, all of it, or a great deal of it, goes to the wayside. It's just pure pragmatic geopolitics.
Not for everybody.
Okay.
I mean, I think, for example, it would be hard to explain Turkey's policy towards Syria unless you understood the depth of the feeling of many Turks to seeing their fellow Sunni Muslims being killed. I think that, I mean, there are certainly different instances. Now, I mean, the obvious difference between what we saw in Libya and what we're seeing in Syria is the West intervened in Libya and not in Syria militarily. And I think it's just, I mean, I think that's explained by the fact that Syria is just a much harder country to conduct a military operation against. And it would be, I mean, you really would have to have a much more direct role of Western forces than they had in the past in Libya supporting the indigenous forces. So it's, I mean, I'm sure you could break it down by individual people, though. Some people are very much motivated by moral factors in terms of how they're viewing what's happening in the Middle East, whereas others, it's more instrumental, economic, geopolitical. So it's hard to generalize.
Okay, that's why we're doing this program here. James, what do you think? I mean, if it were possible for a military intervention, successful military intervention in Syria, would you support it?
Well, at the Heritage Foundation, we oppose a direct U.S. military intervention in Syria.
Why is that? Why is that in Syria? Okay, it sounds like on this case. Why is that?
In part because we think there's a war brewing in the future between the U.S. and Iran, and I think it would be a mistake to get bogged down in Syria in an open-ended humanitarian intervention. The U.S. did not have a very good experience with humanitarian intervention in Somalia, where we went in to feed starving Somalians and ended up getting in fights with Somalian militias who were the problem, who were starving their own people and taking the food. So, you know, if this was an isolated case and there wasn't a possible war with Iran on the horizon, then I would look at it differently. But I would not want to get into some kind of humanitarian intervention. To me, if you're going to intervene, you should go after the cause of the problem, and that's the regime. And to me, if the only worthwhile objective would be to get rid of that regime. But then, of course, once that's done, military force can destroy things, but it's very hard to build things.
Well, we learned that
afterwards.
in Libya, didn't we? Dawood, if I go back to you in London, what about what form of intervention, if any, would you support in looking at Syria today?
Well, let me say first of all, I think it has to be premised on the popular consensus. The people of Syria should, unfortunately, at the present time, they don't seem to speak with a unanimity in terms of intervention. There are those who call for direct intervention and those who call for a safe corridor or a no-fly zone. Unlike Libya, where there was a much more strong and vociferous consensus, both from the Arab League and the Libyan people. But as my colleague just mentioned, in the case of Libya, we've seen the sad consequences. Today, Benghazi is almost threatening and calling for self-autonomy. And the state of Libya itself, as we knew it over the last 50 years, is very much hanging in the balance. In the case of Syria, what will happen? Any military intervention will not be a quick job. It will take time. It will be protracted because Baghdad will support the regime in Damascus. And a protracted military confrontation in Syria would also lead to the possible fragmentation of the state. And this is the danger.
Okay, we could also see a possibility of our partition there. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the geopolitical fate of the Middle East. Stay with RT. Okay, Richard, if I can go back to you in Washington, one of the criticisms that the West always gets during these amazing changes going on in North Africa and the Arab world is that, it was the West that was supporting dictators, because the trade-off was always, the dictators will create security and they'll be a good ally, okay? And the democracy was not high on the agenda. Then we go through this phase where there's hesitation in dealing with, these democratic movements. And then finally, there is a considerable concern in the West about the fate of democracy, but there's a lot of wiggle room. There's Saudi Arabia, there's Qatar, there's the Palestinian issue, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, to what degree is the West and major powers still determining the geopolitical fate of this region? Okay, and I can think of what's going on with Egypt right now, for example.
Well, I think there are two questions embedded in what you just said. I think your description is accurate that for some people, the democratization agenda is very important. For others, it's not. But there are, of course, competing goals in each case. So even those people who support or really consider democracy really important, basically what you said is what Secretary Clinton and President Obama already said, that in the past we didn't emphasize democratization enough. Still, in other cases, trade-offs are going to come in, geopolitical factors, oil, other sources. With respect to the question of how much influence the U.S. has, that's a slightly different question. It's not so much direction of policy, but the impact of policy. And there, what we're seeing is it's a lot harder than it was earlier for foreign powers to be able to determine events in these countries because of the fact that the people are starting to empower themselves. You see these social revolutions. So it's not clear to me that the West, short of a military intervention, can really determine the outcome. And even then, we've seen this in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, that is, once the West removes its forces or the regime, of course, takes on a dynamic of its own, as you would expect. So the people are struggling then, trying to, even when they want to influence, what other alternative tools are there, soft power, economic, but it's difficult. And in a way, that's not necessarily bad. That means the local people are having a greater say in determining their own future, as long as you end up with the people rule rather than local dictators or is the case, is often the case in a civil war, whoever has the strongest force.
It's interesting, James. I mean, you can see that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example, are very good surrogates for the United States and its allies. And when we look at what's going on with Bahrain, because again, that's a huge double standard right there, where the United States and its allies will talk about democratization in some places, but it's pretty much the word on Bahrain. I mean, that's where the geopolitical element comes into it. How much does it bother you about the level of hypocrisy? Because people on the ground will say, well, you know, the Tunisians can have it, you know, but Palestinians can't have it, of course, okay? And then Bahrain, they can't have it as well. I mean, how does this skew the whole democracy issue that the West talks about on one side of its mouth, but then can use military force on the other side?
Well, I think there are some in the West that are pressing Saudi Arabia and Bahrain to hold elections. But I think the problem is that too often things get simplified to say that democracy equals elections. And really, elections are just one of the last phases of democracy. There has to be a supportive civil society that respects the rule of law and that there are protections for minority rights so you don't end up with tyranny of the majority. But in general, you know, a situation like Bahrain is difficult, although it's much easier to rectify if you consider that some of the protesters in Bahrain want an Iranian-style government, which would lead to even less freedom for their people, less genuine democracy. And, you know, everything gets confused and the waters become muddy because everybody's speaking about democracy, but they often mean very different things.
Okay. Now, in London, if I go to you, I mean, again, it seems to be a huge double standard right there. And I'm not really sure how many people in Bahrain want to have an Iranian-style government. I've heard that before, but I haven't seen much evidence of it. Is the West still tainted by supporting very medieval regimes like Saudi Arabia? And Qatar is the last country that comes to my mind when democracy is mentioned.
Yes, I do think that this is a case on the street throughout the Arab region. You know, the manner in which, you know, the West has engaged in this trade-off between stability on the one hand and democracy on the other. For decades, they've opted for stability at the expense of democracy. But over the last year, I believe that there is a rethink in some quarters in the West. That the time has come to really respect the views of the people in the region. They have clearly demonstrated their desire for genuine independence, for participation, and respect for the rule of law. The West cannot preempt what will happen. It therefore has to give the emerging forces, the newly elected governments, an opportunity to rule, to govern, and to prove themselves. And if they fail, then they can be disregarded. But to predict and to say, well, they will establish dictatorships, I don't think this is a very fair option. Now, in the region itself, the newly elected governments have made it clear that they are less concerned about ideology and more about values and interest, national interest. And on this basis, I think the Western governments would be able to engage in a meaningful discourse on the basis of mutual respect and the protection of interest. The West, its basic interests in the Middle East are the flow of oil, the security of Israel. Once that is guaranteed, I don't think they would care much about the nature of the regime, as we have seen in the past.
I think so, it's, Richard, that's a very good point. Richard, I'd like to go to you. I think it's interesting over the course of the last year. I can remember a year ago people say, oh, these Islamic parties are going to take over, and people were a little scared about that. But we've seen with Tunisia and with Libya and we have in Iraq as well. I mean, you have these parties that are coming to power or have come to power or in the process of coming to power, and they don't seem very scary as they did at one point. I mean, is the West learning to understand that the Islam can have its own democratic values and institutions?
Well, we've always had this debate about whether if the Islamist parties, or in the Cold War it was the Communist parties, if they come to power, could that see a mellowing of their beliefs, the pragmatic challenges of governing, having to provide social services, having to have an effective economy. And the evidence is mixed. I mean, so far, you're right. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has pursued, I mean, it's actually generally seen as more moderate branch of the Islamist movement compared to some of the second place party, which is much more extremist. But in Libya, there's still this nagging doubt over how that dynamic's going to play itself out. In Bahrain, as James was sort of implying, that what you've got because of the fact that as the struggle progresses, the extremists tend to strengthen. So you're seeing this in Syria, you're seeing this in Bahrain, that the opposition, being frustrated, is starting to drift more towards extremist solutions. Now, the hope is when the conflict ends, they'll rebound back, but we just don't know. And I mean, the West, like everybody else, is sort of grappling with this issue about how do you, if you do have a change in regime, to ensure you end up with a democratic government, or at least a non-oppressive one. And this is a problem now we're facing with Iraq, that the dynamics are leading to, basically, we are fearing we've created another Saddam Hussein type government, which, despite our best efforts. So I'm not sure the West has learned the lessons, and I'm not even sure what the lessons are yet. I still think
I think I know one lesson. When there's a military intervention in Iraq and Libya, it usually ends very badly, and you don't get anything near that you were hoping for. What do you think about that, James?
Well, I think, wars have unintended consequences. And although the U.S. did defeat Saddam Hussein in Iraq, when it turned over control of Iraq to the different political parties, then as Iraq recovered its sovereignty, U.S. influence was very limited, and I think is extremely limited today, perhaps overshadowed by Iranian influence. But that's, decision of the Iraqis. And I would expect in Libya, too, that, as they say in the Middle East, no good deed goes unpunished. So, although Libyans now have a good feeling about being delivered from Gaddafi, if this revolution becomes factionalized and there's a struggle for power, then I think those good feelings could disappear pretty quickly. So there's no, permanent store of credit, I would say, in the Middle East, although, I think the U.S. Is perceived to be a more benign power, even by many Islamists after Libya.
Okay, Dowd, if I go to you to London, we already heard it. We heard it in the beginning of the program, and we just heard it, the law of unintended consequences. Okay, I posited the thesis that military interventions really do make that term, the law of unintended consequences, very, very meaningful in a geopolitical sense.
What I'd like to say in this regard is that in the case of Libya, Libya was a bit of a peculiarity. It didn't have a functioning state before the uprising. I mean, Gaddafi had no judiciary. He was the state, he and his family. There was no constitution, no parliament, as we know it. And this was the problem. Once he was overthrown, the Libyan people found themselves in a situation where they had to build a state from scratch, from zero. And this is a problem. It is the birth of a state. We are seeing the birth pangs of a state from its very beginning. And so too in Iraq, what happened, the organs of the state were dismantled. The army, the judiciary, everything was dismantled. And this is why we had the mayhem and confusion that followed, after the defeat of Saddam Hussein. In Tunisia, the institutions of state remained in place. We had the parliament, we had the judiciary, and the electoral process was able to
okay, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in here. We've run out of time. Fascinating discussion about the fate of the Arab Spring. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.